Once upon a time, in the prosperous kingdom of Arithmos, lived King Solon. His kingdom thrived because he was generous with the royal treasury, lending gold to merchants, farmers, and explorers to grow their business. However, King Solon had a problem. Some people never paid the gold back, and the treasury was starting to run dry. To save his kingdom, he summoned his grand vizier.
You do not despair. The kingdom still stands.
But for how long, cleric?
Vizier developed a magic prophecy machine which predicted if a potential borrower can default in future or not.
This graph represents the merchant's highest exposure. It cannot be ignored.
The data is clear. The risk is too great.
Hi all, I'm Mehul and this is Predictively Rational. This story was a short demonstration on how credit risk models work. However, the only difference is that to understand the bureau history of a customer, we no longer need wizardry, we have credit bureaus. However, to arrive at the probability of default of a customer based on this bureau history is nothing less than wizardry, and that's where credit risk models comes in. In the last episode, we discussed the various types of credit risk models and the basics of credit risk models. In the current episode, we'll be talking about the various stages involved in building a credit risk model. First step in building a model is defining the model objective. And this model objective need to come from the business team because the model output, whether it be the disbursement rate, the disbursement amount, the default rate, or the default expected or the default actual, are all directly impacting the business. For example, for some models, a business objective could be reducing the existing default rates, maintaining the current disbursement rate. For some models, the objective could be increasing the disbursement, maintaining existing default rates. Model objective in most practical scenarios will be a combination of the above. At this stage, it should also be decided at what part of the pipeline will the model be placed. Will it be before the business rule engine or after? Are the rules of the business rule engine overlapping with the model rules, etc.? Usually it's advisable to score the through-the-door population with the model because it is always beneficial to evaluate the model performance on the reject pool in retrospect. However, this will again depend on what kind of model we are talking about. All models are built on past disbursement data by looking into its performance in retrospect. So ideally, this time frame should represent a business as usual scenario which is expected to be repeated in future. However, if the model objective demands it to perform in some shock scenarios, then that scenario should also be part of the model. So this step involves looking into the dispersed/rejected pool in retrospect and identifying the time frame that need to be used to build the model. It need to be noted that whatever the dispersed time frame is, performance of these trade lines will be 12 months or 18 months ahead based on the performance window. So the identified disbursement window need to be mature enough to have sufficient performance window to define the target. Before going into subsequent steps in model building, we need to understand how a credit bureau profile of a customer will look like. Figure shows a sample representation of bureau history of a customer. The dark line in the middle shows the point of origination of the loan, L5, which is under consideration for model building. Yellow trade lines represent the trade lines of a customer for the same company for which the new loan is considered. And the blue line represents other company trade lines pre and post disbursement. And the region right to the dark line represents performance of the customer post disbursement, and the region left represents bureau history of the customer pre disbursement. Origination company will have the privilege to see the whole right side only if the bureau scrub is received from the bureau, or else only performance on the yellow trade lines, which is part of the company books, is available. Once bureau representation of credit history of a customer is understood, defining subsequent stages of model development is easy. So let's move to step 3. The target of default is always decided based on right side region post disbursement. However, what day past due of the customer to be considered as the definition of default is decided based on day past due/DPD bucket movement. A DPD value showing a DPD threshold, which is virtually a point of no return, is considered as a default target. In DPD bucket movement example given, DPD 90 can be considered as a target since after crossing that threshold, rollback are virtually nil and the majority of the bucket is getting rolled forward. This stage decides what period of performance to be considered for target evaluation. Performance window need to be large enough to make a conclusive decision on target. Based on performance in this maturity period, it will be decided if a customer is good or bad. This period is usually decided based on the default trend observed in the portfolio for a specific cohort. Post a specific maturity period of a cohort, the default percentage in the portfolio is expected to stabilize. This region of stabilization is a good indicator of sufficient maturity period/performance window. This represents the left-hand side region of the origination line. On a lighter note, this can be called the karma period of the customer in the past, which will be impacting the credit decisioning in future. All features for the model will only be generated based on this window, so any customer payment pattern before this threshold period will not be impacting the credit score. That's all for this episode. Further stages of model development will be discussed in subsequent sections. Thank you.